In a vast desert of digital noise, find your peaceful oasis in the glowing neon of our cinematic storytelling world. We offer a place for deep reflection, raw emotion, and the beauty of art. Click subscribe now and find your sanctuary in our world of vivid stories.
My director looked me dead in the eye through that conference room glass and said, "Look, Marcus, if you're not comfortable with where this company is headed, maybe it's time you found somewhere that better fits your comfort level." He said it with a smile. The kind of smile that isn't really a smile at all. It's a warning dressed up in dental work. That was a Tuesday morning in March. I had been with Hargrove Financial Solutions for 11 years. 11 years. I remember the exact count because I had been thinking about it that morning on the drive in, thinking about how I'd joined straight out of my second tour with the Army, how I'd built their entire compliance infrastructure from scratch when they were still operating out of a converted warehouse in suburban Columbus. I'd stayed through 3 CEOs, 2 acquisitions, and 1 near collapse that nobody outside the building ever heard about, because I made sure they didn't. And now my director, a man named Richard Calloway who had been with the company for 14 months, was sitting across a mahogany table suggesting that I might be more comfortable somewhere else. I didn't say anything right away. I learned that in the service. The first person to fill silence usually loses. Richard shifted in his chair. "The new compliance framework coming down from the parent company," he said, smoothing his tie, "requires a more agile approach. We need people who can move fast, adapt, not get bogged down in legacy processes." Legacy processes. I filed that away. "I understand," I said. "Great." He seemed relieved. "So you'll review the new framework documentation this week and get back to me with a transition plan?" "I'll review the documentation," I said. What I did not say was that I had already reviewed it. I had reviewed it 3 weeks earlier, the day it landed in my inbox from the parent company's legal team in Chicago. I had reviewed it the same way I used to review operational briefings, line by line, looking for exposure. And what I found in those pages had kept me up for 2 nights straight, because the new framework wasn't a compliance upgrade. It was a liability transfer. I drove home that evening the long way, through the old neighborhood where I'd rented an apartment when I first started at Hargrove, back when I was just happy to have a desk and a steady paycheck after 3 years of sand and uncertainty. The streets looked the same gas station on the corner of Maple and 5th, the same diner where I used to eat lunch alone because I didn't know anyone yet. I thought about the 11 years. I thought about Richard's smile. Then I went home and I opened the fireproof filing cabinet in my home office, the one my wife always teased me about, called it my war chest, and I pulled out a folder I had started building 4 months earlier. I want to explain something about how I was trained to think, because it matters to what comes next. In the Army, you don't wait until the enemy is at the wire to start planning your defense. You identify vulnerabilities before they become emergencies. You document everything. You establish chains of custody. You assume that at some point someone is going to ask you to account for every decision you ever made, and you make sure you can. I had brought that habit with me into civilian life. My wife said it made me paranoid. My attorney said it made me unusual. In 11 years at Hargrove, it had mostly just made me thorough. Until 4 months ago, when I started reviewing the parent company's acquisition paperwork and found something that made my stomach drop. The acquisition agreement, signed 18 months prior, contained a clause, buried in Exhibit F, subsection 12, paragraph 4, that transferred liability for any pre-existing regulatory violations to the acquired entity, meaning Hargrove, meaning us. And I knew about 3 pre-existing regulatory violations that had never been properly disclosed. I knew because I had flagged them internally, twice, in writing. The first time, 14 months ago, 1 month before Richard arrived. The second time, 8 months ago, in a memo that went to the previous director of compliance and copied the CFO. Both times I was told the issues were being handled. Both times, nothing happened. I had kept copies of everything. Of course I had. When Richard unveiled the new compliance framework in the all-hands meeting the following week, he stood at the front of the room with a laser pointer and talked about efficiency and integration and moving forward as a unified entity. He talked for 35 minutes. 3 people asked questions. I did not ask any. After the meeting, my colleague from the audit team, a woman named Sandra who had been at Hargrove almost as long as I had, caught up with me in the hallway. "You doing okay?" she said quietly. "You had that face on all week." "What face?" Your army face, she said. The one where you're very calm and very far away at the same time. I looked at her. Sandra was sharp. She always had been. I'm fine, I said. Just processing. She studied me for a second, then nodded slowly like she didn't entirely believe me but was going to respect it anyway. That's the thing about people who've worked together long enough. You develop a language made mostly of what you don't say. I went back to my office and I called my attorney. His name is Walter Briggs. He's been practicing employment and regulatory law in Columbus for 30 years. He's the kind of lawyer who speaks very slowly and never seems impressed by anything, which is exactly the kind of lawyer you want when you found what I'd found. Walk me through the timeline again, Walter said. I walked him through it. The original flags, the memos, the non-responses, the acquisition clause, the new framework that would, if implemented, effectively overwrite the internal documentation trail. There was a long pause on the other end. You retained physical copies of everything, he said, and digital on a personal encrypted drive. Nothing on company servers. Another pause. Marcus, I want you to do nothing until we speak in person. Can you come in Thursday? I can come in tomorrow. Thursday, he said. I need time to review what you're sending me. I sent him everything that night, 63 pages. I had organized them chronologically, with a summary index at the front, the way you'd structure an after-action report. Thursday morning, I sat across from Walter in his office on High Street, watching him turn pages. He'd been doing this for 30 years, and he still turned pages slowly, like each one deserved consideration. I had always respected that about him. When he finished, he set the folder down and looked at me over his reading glasses. Are you aware, he said carefully, that what you've described here, the undisclosed violations, the liability transfer clause, the suppression of your internal flags, may rise to the level of securities fraud? I had suspected, but hearing Walter say it was different. I'm aware that the SEC might see it that way, I said. The SEC, Walter said, and potentially the Department of Labor, depending on how the employee retirement accounts were handled during the acquisition period. He paused. This is a significant exposure, Marcus, for the company, and potentially for specific individuals. Richard, I asked. Richard arrived after the original violations, Walter said, but depending on what he knew when he implemented this new framework. He let the sentence hang. He had the same documentation I had, I said. He was copied on my second memo. I have the red receipt. Walter looked at me for a long moment. You have a red receipt, he said. I have a red receipt. He took off his reading glasses. I think, he said slowly, that before you do anything else at that company, we need to talk about the Sarbanes-Oxley whistleblower provisions. I had been waiting for him to say that. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act, for those who aren't familiar, contains protections for employees who report securities fraud at publicly traded companies, or companies whose parent entities are publicly traded, which Hargrove's parent company was. Those protections include reinstatement, back pay, and legal fees if the employee faces retaliation. They also create an obligation for the company, once a formal complaint is filed, to preserve all relevant documentation, which meant that if Richard's new compliance framework was designed, even partially, to overwrite that documentation trail, filing a formal complaint would freeze it in place. I filed through Walter on a Friday afternoon. The following Monday, I came to work as normal. I answered emails. I attended the morning stand-up. I ate lunch at my desk. I gave no indication that anything had changed. Richard called me into his office at 3 o'clock. Marcus, he said, I wanted to touch base on the transition plan. I haven't seen anything from you yet. I've been thorough, I said. I want to make sure I get it right. He studied me. Richard was not a stupid man. I want to be clear about that. He was a man who had been put in a difficult position by people above him and had made the decision to push through rather than push back. I understood that choice, even if I couldn't respect it. I need it by end of week, he said. You'll have something by end of week, I said. What he had by end of week was a letter from Walter, delivered to the company's general counsel, notifying them that a formal whistleblower complaint had been filed and that any alteration, destruction, or concealment of relevant documents would constitute obstruction. I heard about the reaction secondhand through Sandra, who heard it through the CFO's assistant, who apparently described the general counsel's face when he read that letter as the specific shade of white that precedes fainting. I was not in the building when the letter arrived. I had taken a personal day. I drove out to a state park about 40 minutes east of the city, a place I used to go fishing with my father when I was a kid. I hadn't been out there in probably 6 years. The water was cold and flat, and the trees were just starting to come back after winter. The kind of pale green that looks almost uncertain, like it isn't sure spring is really committed yet. I sat on the bank for 3 hours and didn't fish. Just sat. My wife called at noon to check in. She knew the broad strokes. I had told her enough to explain why I'd been sleeping badly and working late in the home office. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Like I'm standing on solid ground," I said. "And I've been standing on it the whole time, I just couldn't see it." She was quiet for a moment. "Come home for dinner," she said. "I'm making the short ribs." I went home for dinner. What followed over the next 6 weeks was not dramatic in the way people imagine legal and regulatory processes to be. There were no courtrooms, no shouting, no moment where I stood up and delivered a speech. Mostly it was emails between attorneys and quietly rescheduled meetings and a series of requests for documentation that Hargrove's legal team had to comply with because the preservation order was already in place. The SEC opened a preliminary inquiry based on Walter's filing. The Department of Labor began a separate review of the acquisition period retirement account activity. The parent company's general counsel flew in from Chicago. I saw him in the lobby one morning, moving very quickly in the direction of the executive conference room, not making eye contact with anyone. Richard's implementation timeline for the new compliance framework was postponed indefinitely. Then it was canceled. Then Richard himself was placed on administrative leave, pending an internal review, which everyone understood to be the interval between a decision being made and the paperwork catching up to it. Sanders stopped me in the parking lot one morning during all of this. It was early, barely light, and there was still frost on the windshields. "Did you know this was going to happen?" she asked. "I knew what was in the documents," I said. "I didn't know what they'd do with the information." "They lit themselves on fire," she said, with a kind of wondering disbelief, like she still couldn't quite believe it. "They were already on fire," I said. "I just declined to bring water." She laughed once, short and surprised. Then she shook her head and walked to her car. "I want to say something here because I think it matters. I did not do any of this because I wanted to destroy Hargrove or hurt Richard personally or watch anyone suffer. I want to be honest about my own motivations, the way I tried to be honest in every memo and every filing. I did it because I had spent 11 years building something I was proud of, and when I saw it being used as a mechanism to protect someone else's exposure at the expense of the people who worked there, at the expense of coworkers who had their retirement accounts tied up in an acquisition that wasn't disclosed cleanly, I could not stand by and let that happen. I had made a promise when I left the service. Not a formal one, not written down anywhere, but a real one. I would not be the person who knew something wrong was happening and looked away. I had almost been that person once, early in my career, over something smaller. I had let a manager convince me that flagging a process irregularity would cause more trouble than it was worth. I had told myself it wasn't that serious. It wasn't really my job. Someone else would catch it. Nobody caught it. 6 months later, it became a much larger problem, and 2 people lost their jobs over it, and neither of them was the manager. I never made that mistake again. The formal outcome, when it came, was structured the way these things usually are, quietly, in language designed to say as little as possible. The parent company settled the SEC inquiry without admitting wrongdoing. A compliance remediation program was established. Several members of senior leadership at both the parent company and Hargrove departed, including Richard, described in the company communication as pursuing other opportunities. My position was not eliminated. My 11 years of institutional knowledge turned out to be somewhat valuable when the new compliance requirements started coming in from the regulators, since I had built the original infrastructure and understood exactly where everything was. The new director of compliance, brought in from outside, called me in his first week and asked me to walk him through the documentation systems. I walked him through everything. I answered every question. I shared every file. That's the thing people miss sometimes about how I was trained to operate. It was never about holding cards close or protecting territory or making sure I was the only one who knew things. It was about building systems that worked and making sure they kept working and making sure that the people who came after you could understand what you built. Richard had seen that as a liability, as legacy thinking. He had been wrong. I still drive the long way home sometimes, through the old neighborhood. Past the gas station on Maple and 5th, past the diner, I think about the 22-year-old version of me who ate lunch there alone, who didn't know anything yet about corporate structure or securities regulation or preservation orders, who just wanted a steady paycheck and a chance to build something. I think he'd be surprised by how it turned out, not the legal outcome. I don't think he'd fully understand that, but the part where, when it mattered, I didn't look away. That part I think he'd recognize. My wife asked me once, during the worst of the waiting period when we didn't know how the inquiry would resolve, whether I regretted filing. I thought about it seriously before I answered, because she deserved a serious answer. No, I said. Even if it had gone the other way, I still have to live in my own head. She nodded. She's been with me long enough to understand what I mean when I say things like that. The short ribs were good that night, by the way. They always are.